Hi, all you miracles and healing and allies. I am back once again for another part in the series that I'm doing a survivor's perspective on understanding traumatic dissociation, especially centered around like ritual abuse and mind control kinds of instances. I am a survivor of these things myself, so obviously we're going to be talking about those things on this episode. So if this is the first one that you found me on, I would highly recommend watching the first few episodes in the series, because they're going to give you some context for everything that we're going over today, as well as a trigger warning on the content that we're going to be discussing, essentially. All right. So I'm going to try and use my time wisely. I finished up on the last couple videos talking about the system, essentially. So I just kind of started off today with just having my same basic little sketches of the two different kinds of systems that I tend to refer back to while talking about we're building on our knowledge of understanding how dissociative splitting happens. Trauma pockets are formed around traumatic events throughout our development, represented here usually, by our little nodes on the branching, essentially to show that there is a pocket, essentially, of traumatic experience that gets isolated in the subconscious from the rest of the consciousness that the survivor accesses in day-to-day life. So with what I have here labeled with the O is organic multiplicity. So with organic multiplicity, that's going to be a dissociative system, like we've gone over before, that most likely is dealt with incest or some other sort of usually caregiver-driven abuse that's been consistent, in the child's life, something that has essentially necessitated the child to have to form these traumatic splits, and then often separate personalities that form because of those splits having somewhat separate consciousnesses, that essentially this is going to be a system that's formed when you are dealing with a lot of abuse, but not necessarily abuse that's coming from abusers that are aware of what they're doing and the dissociative splitting that is happening in the child. So when it comes to the managed multiplicity, and like we talked about last time, usually the way this is going to be presented is that we're going to have, this is our original baby, this is our multiple ego states that happens just as the function of being alive, and experiencing different physical and emotional sensations and attachment needs. And with a negative influence as far as like a consistent caregiver that is inconsistent or abusive, you're going to start having some interruption in the kind of interweaving the integration of these different ego states for the child, and start having your dissociative splits. You're going to still have usually a lot of amnesia, but still some sort of consciousness that is a common thread through a survivor's life, and that is usually what I represent here, essentially on this line. So with this is the organic multiplicity. This is your original, so a lot of times we'll call it the core here, and it creates all these different splits, but also continues to the main altar, which is the front here. Sorry, I'm doing a lot of drawing behind myself. And this front here is usually the front that's seeking therapy, that is experiencing the interruption in their lives because of PTSD triggers and all these parts essentially coming from the subconscious into the consciousness and creating a lot of, essentially emotional and physical turmoil and symptoms in the survivor's life. You're in the managed multiplicity, you're going to usually have this compounded in one or more ways. It's either going to be compounded in the fact that you're going to have something like this that is just a lot larger, essentially, or what you're going to have is essentially an early split, most likely before the age of 7, of a essentially very early split of a abuser allied. So I've used this to represent here, our core, and it's moving along and everything. And at this point is where we're talking about you can have essentially multiple systems where you're working with abusers that are completely aware of the developmental ages and exactly what traumas to be putting the child through to create specific splits. And usually they've created a main part who that they're going to create this separate system off of, that they've 100% ensured is trauma bonded to the abusers in a incredibly thorough way. So that might include like near-death experiences. In my experience, it was being threatened to be killed and then being rescued by an abuser. This is going to create essentially trauma bonded parts that are born in those moments of extreme trauma and see the abusers as saviors or allies or family, lovers, all kinds of things, but it's going to be something. The whole foundation of this second system here is going to make sure the abuser is going to make sure it's going to be trauma bonding, mainly so that for 2 reasons, like I went over last time, that you want to make sure that both you as abusers are going to be able to access this line of the system, and then create further splits off of that if you're training in like more skills or parts that they just want to be accessed by the organized crime group or the cult or something. Essentially, they're going to want to make sure that any like child prostitute parts, assassin parts, anything, bestiality related, anything that's going to be like way above the norm and outside most people's reality is going to be, things that they're going to split off of in this way, mainly for creating the secrecy, like we're saying, from those parts of the child from the outside world, but also from themselves, from this whole line of the system, this this core that leads to this front that the survivor experiences. Essentially, that whole system might experience something more normal, like because you are getting some splitting, like incest basically, like, or like addiction in the home or things like that. So the survivor's already dissociative, they're going to be getting some splitting of things that are kind of seen as more like normal, quote unquote, traumas, things that are a little bit easier to both believe and deny, too. When it comes to dealing with organized groups and ritual abuse, they're going to be a lot of times creating whole other systems that are just focused on an early split that is very trauma bonded and a lot of times shares the same ideology as the cult and stuff, that essentially they can then access. It kind of gives them a head start when creating new parts to already have a part out that already has gone through all the traumas necessary to you know, create certain belief systems either about the world, you know, that are in line with what the abusers believe, whether that's, you know, fucked up psychopathy or, you know, a fucked up, you know, cult mentality or something like that, or you know, normalizing sex, you know, with adults, all kinds of things like that. You know, those are all going to be parts that are centered off of here, and then they can then train more skills essentially. But then also they can bury, because these are going to be experiencing the most intense traumas, they can essentially bury in kind of a deeper level of the subconscious the more extreme essentially abuse memories and stuff, for a couple reasons. Again, just because, one, it's because they don't want the survivor accessing it and breaking down in day-to-day life, you know, if they remember all their torture memories, but also because they can then be pulled up essentially purposefully, because the abusers are aware that they're there, into the front by the gatekeeper, which often comes from this line of the split here. And essentially they're going to have complete awareness of both systems. That's their role, you know, as like a gatekeeper, is that they're going to have like some understanding of everything, and essentially as a way to keep the conscious front in line, either internally with like certain subject matters, you know, not thinking about certain abuse things, or reinforcing denial, or essentially just trying to like throw as many obstacles internally but also physically in the body, like when it comes to pulling up body memories of torture. That's where you'll have like a lot of survivors of ritual abuse like having what presents as maybe fibromyalgia or IBS, or you know, like random just aches and pains, sometimes bruises appearing that you don't know where they came from, all kinds of stuff. A lot of times that can be coming from like essentially torture memory parts that were brought up by the gatekeeper intentionally into the consciousness, essentially to you know, punish the survivor for doing something against the what is the perceived wishes of the abusers, or, you know, to keep them in line in some other way. And then you'll also have usually in these systems, you know, this is your subconscious in the past, and then this is your current consciousness. Sorry, getting over a cold. What you'll also usually have is maybe a like shell part or some other part essentially that's here to you know, a lot of times this is the survivor's like internal awareness, and then this would be the part that the abusers really would like the rest of the world to see. You know, it's usually going to be that unbreakable mask. It's a very empty part that can smooth the transitions of all this different stuff that's happening, and in public especially 100% of the time present the way in the role, you know, the presentation, the front that the abusers have determined for the survivor, you know. So even if, you know, internally they're dealing with like a lot of, you know, depression or different things, you know, the shell or mask part is usually going to be there to you know, prevent any like leaking externally of the internal turmoil that's going on, and also making sure to kind of like, I've always called it maybe like do the tap dance, you know, is kind of how it's essentially like a part that's always performing for the public to ensure that you always seem normal, you know, as normal as possible, considering all of the things that like you've gone through, which a lot of times makes you seem a lot more normal or high functioning. A lot of DID people, you know, have parts that are fronts, they're survivors, you know, they're survivors. So because of that, you know, will sometimes seem incredibly high functioning, or have your shit together basically, until you start, you know, really experiencing a lot of PTSD symptoms at some point in life because of life events. A lot of times we'll do a whole new video just on what causes memories and flashbacks to be triggered and how to manage them when they do. Hopefully that's going to be one I do pretty soon, just because I'm trying to focus on the things that are like foundational or really important if you are earlier in healing, because I know that that's the place that feels both the most lonely and the most scary, and a lot of times where you feel like you're stuck or not making progress. So trying these little things to help both you as the front, but also all your internal parts that you're working with, to conceptualize what the heck happened to you is my main focus. It's just trying to take it from crisis point to a place where you feel more stable and more workable. That's always our goal in dissociative therapy, I think, is to be balanced and be able to work with all the parts that we already have. Okay, so now that I've done my long recap, sorry I'm a little bit wordy always, I'm going to be referring back to this, obviously, and this is my really funny ghetto that my son helped me with. These two colored in the hubcaps for me. This is my really fun, silly drawing that I'm going to be using to kind of like describe a lot of like metaphors that we're going to be talking about in this part of the this part of the series. It's really late at night. I'm trying. So this video, the main goal that I have is, most people maybe on here have seen the crazy graph that I posted several months ago that I had intended on doing a video about several months ago at this point, that was all about all of the different presentations, all the different types of alters typically that you will be encountering in your healing, just to kind of like normalize these dissociative parts and like why they present like they do, but then also to kind of give you some insight onto how to manage and communicate with all of these different parts, because that is a huge part of healing. Is as you are dealing with memories and all this kind of stuff, you are going to need to learn to essentially communicate with a lot of parts of yourself that don't necessarily see things the same as you do. So I really wanted to do this last video as kind of a bridge to that, where we can kind of go over the last things that are in the first videos, like a shared experience between all those different parts, regardless of what the insider comes out as, if it's an animal alter, if it's an abuser allied alter, a protector, a child little alter, whatever it is, it's all going to be, in the system like that we've been discussing, and it's all going to be part of your dissociative experiences in life. So that's like this last episode that I want to do, moving on to there, is that it's kind of like the last kind of overview of things that you'll experience as far as like dissociation, and as far as common experiences in the system, regardless of the part that you're going to be encountering. So we'll be doing a deep dive in the next few episodes on just types of parts, how they're formed, through different trauma responses, etc. So this is going to be the kind of last main metaphor that I'll probably be referring to a lot in future videos too, which is usually the car metaphor, and that's something that works really well in my experience for people who are dissociative, but especially if you're in this track of things where you are dealing with a really large number of parts and some possible intentional manipulation there. So we're gonna start here. So just ignore this for me. So we're just gonna start here with just like a car. I usually use like the car as like the metaphor for the body, mainly just because I mean, we're not machines, obviously. We're like beautiful creations of God. But this is like an experience that I can say most people have had. You know, everyone's been in a car. A lot of us, you know, at this point have driven cars, so we understand this. This is also something common for internal parts to be able to understand too. So it's a great metaphor. So essentially, we're like looking at like the body as like the car. Your steering wheel is essentially going to be your consciousness plus control. So I usually consider the whole car interior to be the consciousness. Like that's going to be like any and every part that is present at that moment for the survivor as they were like driving along in our journey through life. So a lot of times, you know, if you're dealing with an organic system, you're going to be dealing with essentially, you know, one part that's the front. A lot of times that is going to be in the body driving, and then you're going to a lot of times have popping in from what I consider the subconscious. I guess so you have that too, sorry. Working on it. So you have back here like essentially our camper, which I consider the subconscious, you know. So this has like essentially a separation in communication between, you know, it's going along for the ride, you know, but anytime we get triggered, essentially it's kind of like pulling over to a pit stop, you know. We're like getting into a crash maybe, you know, like a trigger in life. We're driving along, all of a sudden this is our front here, all of a sudden we encounter something that's triggering. It's almost like getting in a crash. Bam, you stop, and all of a sudden out of the back, the part of you that is triggered, you know, usually a little part, hops out, runs over here, and pops into the passenger seat, essentially. So now you have essentially two consciousnesses there. And that's going to be a lot of times your experience of a flashback, essentially. So you're going to have almost like, you know, your friend who is trying to drive, and then like a screaming child in the passenger seat, or a very demanding backseat driver, for example, or something like that, who has been triggered by the incident and is now also in the body, possibly trying to take control of this wheel, essentially, and cause you, you know, and the body to have the sensations of adrenaline and want to maybe run and hide, or all kinds of things. So essentially what happens is it starts feeling, you know, during a flashback, during incidents where you have these parts leaking into here, it's gonna a lot of times feel like you've got you know, a passenger in the car that's trying to take control of the wheel, take control of the consciousness. Now if this part, small part, you know, or whatever that part presents as, does take control of this consciousness, a lot of times if they take full control, in this instance, you know, there's not a whole lot of room for this person here, because they've essentially been able to arrest, you know, the essentially bring a child part, you know, child's mind, you know, and bring all that present, which is the past, but it's the present for them, take it and essentially supplant the present that you're seeing with their own. And this part, you know, the main part of you, most often in this case, is going to end up here, essentially. So it's like almost like doing like stopping and doing a little, I can't remember what the term is when you like people hop out and switch seats, but basically, so hop out, the new part that's triggered is going to be taking the wheel. The other part is going to be running around into the camper without having any conscious memory then of now this part who is now triggered and in control of the body, basically. That's going to be what's considered like a full blackout. So those are going to be like the different like parts or different types of experiences a lot of times for like dissociation. Oh, for the first one, you have a blackout. I don't know if there's any point writing on it here. But in any case, it helps me. So, with that kind of instance, you're having a full blackout. So that's essentially almost like creating like a new trauma pocket to where now whatever part is in control of the body is going to have their consciousness switched on, and then all of the actions that are being taken from that point forward, all the actions that they are driving the body around to have, are going to be part of their memories, their consciousness. And when the trigger is over, when this part essentially goes back in to the subconscious, and this part resumes control, finally like banging on the door like, let me out, and is able to start driving around again because it's been a child in control up until that point, then what you have is essentially a gap in their memory where now, okay, we're in control of the body again, but there's no, continuous memory. Essentially there's a gap, for the amount of time that this part was in control. So a lot of times too, you can have what's considered a gray out. So with a gray out, so with a gray out, that's going to be another dissociative experience. So with a gray out, a lot of times it seems like this might be a little bit more common when you're dealing with DDNOS, so really large systems or managed systems, basically. Mainly because it is the experience of essentially somewhat co-consciousness, basically. So a lot of times after what a survivor would consider gray out, what you'll experience is feeling like you have a vague recollection of what happened. You might be aware of where you were at, who you were talking to, or maybe that you were having a conversation. You might not remember what the conversation was about. Essentially this is a lot of times the experience somewhat of what a lot of people consider a version of co-consciousness, to where a lot of times this is the experience of here, because they don't necessarily, they know blackouts are going to happen, and they kind of want to prevent them, the abusers do. So a lot of times the front part will take a step back in the consciousness without necessarily having a full amnesiac barrier. You could say that part is, maybe like in La La Land or in the sunken place, if you're familiar with the movie Get Out, which uses the ideas of hypnosis and trauma parts and stuff. But basically it's the idea that most of the time with a gray out, it would be more like, rather than this part when the flashback is happening and this part takes control of the wheel, rather than them ending up all the way here in the subconscious and having a complete mental barrier of the content of what's going on, what you'll end up having is them more like in the back seat, essentially. So able a lot of times to maybe witness but not affect what is going on in the body or in the consciousness, basically. So when it comes to a gray out will essentially be something that involves some level of co-consciousness and vague recollection. I'll also put in here, we've got depersonalization and derealization. Those are long words. Don't worry, guys, I'll be doing graphic ones from now on. It'll be a little bit more legible. On graphic design, so it'll be digital from now on. This will be my last analog. So when it comes to depersonalization and derealization, what you're going to end up having is a lot of times the experience, of not necessarily, to me sometimes it'll go hand in hand, but it's not necessarily a blackout, as in a discontinuation of your memory of your experience, but it's more about your present experience having some element of blockage to it. So with depersonalization, what you'll have is essentially the experience of the front, the main person, a lot of times because of the presence of other parts in the car that they're not fully consciously aware of, they'll have the experience of feeling as if their life is not their own, or they are not the identity that they have. So they'll essentially have the experience of feeling like an actor, or almost, sometimes goes hand in hand with the gray out, watching yourself, from the outside, or watching yourself from the inside, interacting basically. So it'll have this feeling of essentially knowing that you have a certain identity, but not feeling consciously or like mentally or spiritually, etc., connected with that particular identity, so that's a lot of times depersonalization. And you'll also have derealization, which is where a lot of times you'll feel like your life is not real, or a video game or a movie, and that you are maybe like a passive participant in it, or that it's not even real to begin with, like I was saying, like it's a dream, a movie, a video game, something of that nature, to where you feel like you're experiencing it, but on a certain level it's not real, basically. So a lot of times those go hand in hand in the dissociative experience. I think, with more grayouts, or sometimes people have been known to experience these kinds of things like pre-blackout, because it is kind of like the alteration of your consciousness and shifting to another part's consciousness. So a lot of times this experience, for the survivor, especially in here where you're going to have a lot of parts leaking through, or here we have, parts through the day leaking through, is that each time there's like triggers throughout the day, it'll be like having a little stop and having another part come in here. So you can actually sometimes in the consciousness, especially if like it's a rough time of year, or just, you're dealing with like a lot of life stressors or something, a lot of triggers, like I'd mentioned before, a lot of things that can trigger flashbacks and everything coming up, or life events, having kids, or so good things, but that also make you think of you being young, or triggers like tragedies, or just even little things in your life, like smells, sounds, interactions with loved ones that are somewhat reminiscent of scenarios in your childhood. They can essentially, each thing throughout the day, week, month, if you're not dealing with it, can be like having another part pop from here into here. So it'll be like the experience a lot of times will be like you're driving, but having almost like a car full or van full of like arguing and upset children, essentially, or backseat drivers or something like that, and that's the goal, when we have a lot of, that's just the goal with therapy in general, or healing in general, I think, is that, when we're aware that this is what is happening, and know that essentially our whole life is like one long family road trip, then we can do a lot of things as fronts, because we're adults now and we do have some awareness of what's going on. We can do a lot of things, just like an adult in real life, to essentially like be making this experience a lot more smooth and enjoyable for everyone, and a lot of times that's going to be with addressing the needs of these kids and stuff that are popping up, these little parts. And a lot of times that doesn't just mean just picture the road trip. It doesn't just mean like, okay, if they're upset, you're dealing with that, dealing with, like I'd mentioned, the safe space, bring them into a place of comfort and peace and healing and presence, with their higher power and everything. It's also about making sure they have the other needs that are met, is like they're going to get bored. Kids, a lot of times survivors haven't had enough time to play, so making sure that, like, if you have kid parts out that are triggered for negative reasons, that you're also trying to address the positive needs that you can, to essentially give them back, the normalcy in childhood that we can try to, now that we're adults and out of the situation we were as children. So, playtime, snacks, etc., self-care. That's like what it is, but it's self-care that's geared towards your child parts, So, I was gonna say, I think like the last note I'm gonna do on this one today, before I do another part on, I might do another part on just the flashbacks, maybe as a journal exercise before the going into all the different parts and everything. But the last note that I wanted to make was, like, when it comes to this, the analogy that I like to make is it's kind of like almost like having a train, like a caravan of your, of your campers, basically. So because of you dealing with abusers that are very intentionally creating very strong and intentional amnesiac barriers and structures to the system, there are a lot of times going to be those layers that we talk about, that I've mentioned before, where you'll have multiple systems, or entrained in the child, them to enforce in their own brain different layers of this, of compartmentalizing the abuse. You'll have, essentially train, multiple campers, so that are, almost like, I'm sure everyone can visualize it. It would be essentially like having multiple campers that are being pulled along by the body, to where a lot of times, if you are dealing with the multiple or the managed multiplicity, you will, in your first layer, be dealing with this camper, so it may be, like we're saying, all the trauma that's quote unquote more normal. It might be all the incest, so all the parts are around your familial incest, most likely, are going to be here, in this first camper. This is most often the first thing that that a lot of survivors will be dealing with, essentially, in their healing. They're not going to have any context for trafficking or ritual abuse a lot of times, unless they've dealt with the foundation of all of it, which is usually some form of like familial, sexual abuse. So you'll deal with this. And then the survivor will be going along in life and will have something that will trigger what's going on in here. So that was my experience, that essentially I dealt with the first layer, which was the incest of things that are quote unquote more normal abuse. And then as I continued to heal and continued to deal with parts, the parts that had felt that there was some understanding in the front of who my dad was, his obsession with snuff pornography and child pornography in general, and had come to a place of healing, and essentially brought all these parts into a safe place. What ended up happening is the deeper parts that had more intense trauma, then, especially as triggers through life happen, began to share their trauma, and essentially we access the next layer of your trauma parts. And this was a layer that was very intentionally very intentionally hidden by my abusers, and that was the trafficking, essentially. So this is all of your parts that are going to be dealing with not incest, with like one or two family members, essentially, but essentially be dealing with a lot of different abusers, and dealing with entrained like roles and actions to be like performing maybe on film or for the abusers that you're being sold to. Essentially, but it's essentially going to be stuff that's further out of the reality, but also further away from what the abusers want, this part or the world to see. And then a lot of times with ritual abuse, you'll have, another layer as well, at least that was my experience, that when it came to the season R for the ritual abuse, essentially until those parts had really seen these parts and these parts heal, I wasn't able to deal with the level of intensity when it came to especially the violence and those kinds of things that I had to, actually physically be present for, witnessing and participating in. I really, and all the parts that were trying to, participate in all that, that was a whole nother one. And essentially each of these are also fail-safes for the abusers to try and hope that, hopefully they hope that survivor self-destructs or never makes it to this point. But if they do, they hope that this, first one is going to provide enough cover, essentially, of trauma and abuse to work through, essentially, and not be dealing with these other things. For me, realistically, I would never have dealt with the ritual abuse. I've always had an aversion towards babies and kids and stuff. I've always found them very, just triggering. They, make me uncomfortable. I always feel like something bad's gonna happen to them, and I'm just, I have a hard time relating to them a lot of times, too, being, silly and spontaneous. I was always a little adult, basically. So, I had always been adverse to having children, so when I did enough healing to really open up my heart and just love the idea of being a mother and everything, and which I do, it's the greatest joy in my life, but also, other survivors talk about the struggles of parenting when you have all of this in your background, and with having a little infant around me all the time, was on one hand, especially for these parts, the most joyful thing you can ever imagine. But for the parts, all these parts that had only been around babies and kids when they were, being used for horrible things, and had just seen them in pain so many times, kids and babies were just straight triggering, and including my own son even, was just both feeling the idea, because we had seen it happen to so many, that something was going to happen to him too, or also that you know, just the pure fact that in your body, you know, the sensations come up of, you know, just feeling that grief, you know, of all the pain that you've seen and experienced, you know. So it, you know, requires a whole nother, like each step really a lot of times will feel like the beginning of your healing, because it is such heavy and intense material to deal with. But you will find that as you deal with, you know, each of these parts and essentially choose as a front to go in and rescue them, what you'll find is that this whole journey, you know, this family trip will go a lot smoother. So I'll try and do one or two journal accompanying, you know, videos, some shorter ones, obviously, just some little exercises to go along with everything we talked about today, if you're a survivor, just to help you, like, understand and conceptualize and continue your journey in, like, increasing communication and understanding within the system. So as always, I try my hardest to answer any questions that people leave in the comments if you're open to doing that, because I know it's a public forum. And I am always going to try and also address topics like that in an upcoming Q&A, where I'll just do a straight up, you know, just reading of questions and answering them, because I've gotten a lot at this point that I think would be helpful to a lot of different survivors to be answered. So, you know, from my perspective, that's what I humbly say. I'm not an expert. I'm just like an aggregate of a lot of information through my own healing journey, and I just am trying to share it with others who are also trying to understand. So, wordiness aside, this is me saying goodbye to everyone, and thank you for joining me again. I hope that this has created any sort of understanding and enlightenment for you, and I really hope you all like the greatest abundance and blessings on your healing journey. So I'll chat soon. Hey everyone, a quick addition to the video that I just finished filming. I realized I left out a pretty important point that I mentioned several times, but didn't fully explain, just the nature of trying to film things in the middle of the night. So that is what I'm going to put here as another form of dissociation. It's kind of weird because it's not quite dissociation, because it's almost like the lack of it, but it's essentially, you know, co-consciousness is where all the parts are, you know, in this car are essentially sharing the experience. You know, they're all witnessing, you know, possibly giving their input. Co-consciousness is usually a place where you'll have a lot of conflict and arguing, especially early in therapy, because different parts have very different views of the identity that they see themselves as and the routes they would like to take in life, basically, and different preferences, you know, different behaviors, all kinds of things, you know, that you're dealing with. But essentially, co-consciousness, whenever I refer to it, is basically implying that, like, it's including all the parts that are in the car that are sharing awareness, going to be sharing a memory of whatever experiences they're all having. And often, especially later in therapy, there's pretty much always a potential for, you know, productive dialogue when we're in a place of co-consciousness. Some people like to shoot for full integration, where there's all of these parts are coming and joining into one again. It's almost like bringing all this back to where it was. A lot of survivors, including myself, don't see this as a workable solution for our system. So what we do, you know, is just work on leaning towards having co-consciousness between all the parts that need to be involved throughout the day, and having a lot of productive compromise going on between them. All right, that's my sign off. I hope you guys all have a wonderful, wonderful healing journey, and just know that I know they don't come out often, but these videos are always in my mind, because I know that, especially if you're early in healing, having a little bit of understanding for yourself and the parts you're working with can go a long way to feeling like you're moving in the right direction. All right. Have a great one. Bye. Sending blessings.